3 months ago, I decided to make the switch from a Canon DSLR to a Sony mirrorless. I opted for the A7 III, and I personally at this point think I made the right choice. Back when I made the switch, I did actually make a video about it, and it was really interesting seeing the comments because a few people sort of criticized my decision for switching to Sony from Canon, but a lot of other people agreed with me and were actually considering making that switch as well. And that's why 3 months later, I've decided to make this video talking about the pros of switching to Sony, but also some of the cons that I've noticed versus using a Canon DSLR. Before we jump straight into this video, it is worth mentioning that the pros and cons that I'm going to go through are very personal to me. Not every pro that I talk about will be something that you will benefit from, so I'm not expecting people to watch this video and to relate entirely to every single pro and con, but hopefully you will find this video useful. So the first pro that I've noticed by switching to Sony is the fact that my portraits have improved. Now, it's not necessarily that my portraits before with my Canon DSLR were bad, they weren't, but it's more that the actual process of shooting portraits has become a lot easier since switching to the A7 III. The reason for that is because of the eye autofocus and the face detection and everything that my Canon DSLR, the 5D Mark III, didn't have. That's a big deal for me. It makes my shoots a lot easier, and when I'm going through in Lightroom and I'm looking at the shots that I've taken, it seems that, 9 times out of 10, the focus is perfect on the eye with the A7 III. Whereas with my 5D Mark III, I'd shoot, a lot of good photos that were in focus, but there were definitely more that were out of focus, and I'd kind of look to the photo set and think, oh, I wish that one was in focus because it was a really good photo, but sometimes, movement or something kind of throws it off. With the A7 III, honestly, this thing never seems to miss a beat. It's a really great camera, super reliable in terms of portrait photography and capturing eyes perfectly in focus. Now, another big improvement for me, and this one is definitely personal, is my photos of Benji, my dog. So we took him to the beach and I've taken photos of him in the garden, and he moves quick. He's a fast dog and his movements can be unpredictable, but with the A7 III I'm able to take some really brilliant pictures because, again, the animal autofocus. So the first point was about the eye autofocus with people and portraits, but with animals as well, it's incredible. And I know this point in a way is kind of one point, but I think it's important to separate these because animal photos are very different than taking pictures of portraits. Animals move quickly, you need to use high shutter speeds, and that's something where the Sony has really excelled, especially with the eye autofocus. These I would not have been able to get with my 5D Mark III. Now, the other pro of using the A7 III is the weight. So I actually really want to go out and shoot with this camera now. When I had the 5D Mark III, it was so heavy and cumbersome to carry around. A lot of the time, I just didn't actually want to go out and shoot because it was just such a chore to carry it around. It was a really heavy camera, and the lenses as well were really heavy. I think the camera weighed nearly a kilo. It was like 800 grams or something like that. Don't quote me on that. Probably wrong, but it was heavy anyway. And the 24-70 that I used a lot of the time was also about 800 grams, so all in all it was a really heavy piece of kit. Whereas the A7 III weighs about 650 grams, and I'm using mostly prime lenses as well to really keep down the weight of my kit. And this has been a really great setup for me. I actually really enjoy packing up my kit bag and going out and taking photos now. It definitely doesn't feel like I'm carrying around a load of kit, and I've actually got a number of prime lenses I use with the A7 III, and I pack most of them all the time. Whereas with my Canon, I always felt like I needed to choose certain lenses and leave some at home because I didn't want to carry around the extra weight. Now, I do, when I get time, like to do some landscape photography, and the A7 III for me has actually made me climb higher, and that may sound strange or not believable, but quite honestly, when I had the 5D Mark III, I didn't necessarily want to go as high because I had to carry the kit up there. Whereas with the A7 III, I feel like when I'm walking about, I don't really have any limitations, and it's really enabling me to go out and shoot stuff that I wouldn't have got with my 5D Mark III. Now, the next thing would be the quality of my YouTube videos. This is something, again, super personal, but before I used to shoot on the GH5, so not actually anything to do with the Canon at this point. That was a micro 4/3 camera, and in terms of the quality of the videos, they weren't great. There was basically zero depth of field because, well, it's micro 4/3, and everything just felt a little flat. It could have been because it didn't have that full frame sensor, and that's the thing with the Sony A7 III, especially with video. I've noticed that everything looks so silky and smooth, and just everything looks great, and that is definitely down to the full frame sensor. These prime lenses are like f2, f1.8, and the difference is unreal. So I'm really happy with how my videos look now, and this setup works great for me. I've got one camera that does video and photos to a standard that I think looks great, but even when I'm shooting B-roll, the B-roll with the A7 III just looks so much more cinematic and smooth and silky. And what I really like as well is when I'm focusing on certain products, I can really zone in on it because I can blur the background to such an extent that the products are really highlighted, and I really like that. The next pro, and this is something every Sony shooter talks about, is the dynamic range. I feel like this is something that if you have a Sony or you've shot Sony, you'll talk about, and if you haven't shot Sony, you'll be someone that says, oh, Sony shooters always talking about dynamic range. But honestly, I've noticed a huge difference, you know, when I've been out shooting, the ability to bring down so many highlights in editing and bring out detail, which I wouldn't have been able to. I'm seeing a huge difference in dynamic range compared to the 5D Mark III, which I think had around 11.8 dynamic range stops or something like that, whereas the A7 III has close to 15, which that makes a big difference, especially in photos and video. The last pro for me is the E-mount lens system. So I've found that buying secondhand lenses, they've mostly been pretty cheap, but also there's an abundance available from lots of different brands. One thing that kind of put me off switching to the Canon RF lens mount and the Canon R series was the fact that there was barely any lenses available for them other than Canon's own, which are so expensive. Whereas with Sony, there seems to be this almost EF equivalent backlog of lenses, but also other brands making stuff. Tamron, Samyang, there's Sigma, you know, so many different brands making lenses for Sony, whereas Canon seems to have been left in the dark a little bit. Now don't get me wrong, I do know that there are a few lenses from Samyang and Laowa and is that it? I think that's it, available for the Canon RF mount. So I know there's some third party, but there's just not as many as there are with Sony, and that was again a huge factor for me. Another thing that quite excites me is that when I get another Sony camera down the line, it's going to have an E-mount, which I can just use all these lenses and have no problem. Now obviously you could say that, well, if you had a Canon RF mount, then you could just get another Canon camera and it would be the same. Yes, but again, the lens options aren't really there, and to be quite honest, in terms of what would be more affordable for me, having this camera now, I will be able to actually see myself buying another Sony full frame camera down the line because I have more money than if I was to buy the R6 or the R5, because buying those would already set me back quite a bit, and I definitely wouldn't have been able to get as many lenses as I have now for my Sony A7 III. So that's pretty much it for my pros. Let's move on to the cons of switching to the A7 III. So the first thing is dust on the sensor. Now this is a big deal for me actually. I've noticed way more dust on my sensor compared to shooting on the Canon 5D Mark III, and that's simply because the A7 III has no sensor cover at all. When you take the lenses off, the sensor is completely exposed, so dust and whatever grub is going to get on the sensor, and that's as simple as that. Now I do have one of those blowers, and I have also tried the internal sensor cleaning, and you know, it works most of the time, but I do think I'm gonna have to use one of those like sensor cleaning kits at some point, because yeah, it's pretty bad. I can see dust spots on like the majority of my photos nowadays, and that's not great. That's not great. I'm spending extra time editing. That's something that I'm not really happy about, but at the same time, you know, I can live with it. It's not a big deal. Out of say 200 photos, there'll probably be like 2 or 3 that are really bad with dust, and yeah, I can just sit and, you know, whack those out quickly with a tablet. So it's not a big deal, but it's definitely something I've noticed. And Canon's new mirrorless cameras have like a sensor cover. I wish Sony had something like that, and hopefully they might do that on the, you know, the A7 IV when that eventually comes out. But yeah, you know, for now, it's something I've got to deal with, but that's definitely one of the cons for me of switching to this A7 III. That sensor dust is a joke. The other con is the EVF and the screen. They're terrible on this camera. If I'm out in the day, I can't see anything on the screen if it's bright sunlight, and the EVF is really soft and you can't really tell if things are in focus. Luckily, I trust, you know, the eye autofocus and the tracking. The screen is soft and it's not that sharp. There's barely any touchscreen options. It's a real downgrade from my GH5 in terms of how I was able to communicate with the camera and work on certain things. Yeah, the A7 III screen sucks, but it doesn't really take away from my shooting experience because most of the time I'm just relying on the buttons and the viewfinder. So in general, it's fine. It's definitely not great, and when the A7 IV comes out, hopefully that will be improved. And the last thing would be the 8-bit footage. I would definitely have liked 10-bit, but that's all down to me. Like when I bought the A7 III, I knew it didn't have 10-bit, so I can't really call it a con because I knew the camera couldn't do it. But I guess it's a con in the sense of the 8-bit footage I have noticed is a bit limiting. I do start to see banding in some color grades, but yeah, again, this is just a small little obstacle which you can overcome if you know what you're doing. At the end of the day, if I was hired for a pro gig to shoot video, I would probably just hire the A7S III. It's just something to bear in mind, I suppose. If you're looking at getting the A7 III in 2021, you may miss that 10-bit footage. So that's kind of it for my pros and cons after 3 months using the A7 III. There are, of course, more things that, I like about the camera and more things that maybe I don't like so much, but this seemed to be the most concise way to present the things that I do really like about it, and also, some of the things that are probably the worst things for me. But in general, I don't regret getting the A7 III at all and selling my 5D Mark III and my GH5. This camera has been fantastic in pretty much everything I've thrown at it. I love the fact that my YouTube videos look great. My portrait photography from a technical standpoint has improved entirely because of this camera. And as I said, I actually like to go out and shoot now, and I think that's the most important thing about buying a new camera. Is it actually going to make you want to go out and shoot? So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like. If you have any more pros and cons from your own experience, feel free to comment them down below. I'd love to have a discussion about that. This channel is all about photography, videography, content creation, the workflow, my experiences, lighting, all that kind of stuff. If you enjoy that kind of content, be sure to subscribe and hit that little alert button as you'll be notified when I upload something new, and I'll see you guys in the next one.